Hello everyone, this is Teresa LaFleur, your instructor for OST 248. I want to talk to you a little bit on Chapter 5, the coding guidelines, because these are so important. In this chapter, and in all the chapters, you're going to see these highlighted boxes, and those are where the guidelines are. You need to make these notations in your coding manuals from the information that's in here. To help you, because if you're taking the CPC exam, it's really guideline based. You really need to know a lot about the guidelines. So let's take a look in Chapter 5 about this. So first it talks about how to locate a code, and I sent you a video on how to do that. You will always pull up your ICD-10 book, your coding manual, and you'll look at your index located in the front of the book, and that's where you're going to look up whatever that you're trying to find in particular, whatever your course is asking you for. So you're going to look it up in the alpha, and then you're going to go back and verify it in the tabular, which is the numbers in the back part. Now, I hope you have tabbed your book, have followed the guidelines on that video. It makes it a lot quicker and a lot easier to find the section that you need. Otherwise, you spend a lot of time trying to get there instead of actually looking up the codes. So when you are looking at these codes and verifying in the back part, you need to make sure that you do this to the best specificity that you can. And you can go up to 7th characters, and it'll tell you if it needs a 7th character, but make sure that you're reading through there, because specificity is so important in here, and that's why all the changes came in with the ICD-10 from the ICD-9, is because they wanted more codes that were very specific to whatever the case may be. So make sure that you use all the digits that you are supposed to. It can be anywhere from 4 to 7. But you need to make sure that you read what is required for that particular code. Alright, next thing it talks about is signs and symptoms, and signs and symptoms can be used for coding purposes as if there is no definitive diagnosis. But you can't use both of them. You can't have a definitive diagnosis and use a sign or symptom. It's one or the other. And that's the only time that you can use signs and symptoms. Now, sometimes you might have multiple codes for one condition. And basically what you're going to see is it'll tell you to use an additional code. And that code may be for whatever, for example, they're talking about here is bacterial infections. It's going to want to know what is the cause of the bacterial agent, which infection, which type of infection is it. So you're going to have a multiple code on that one. But just remember that it's going to tell you that in the back of the book. When you're looking at that particular code, it'll tell you if it needs additional information. It could tell you a code first. It could tell you any causal condition. It could be used for sequela, and sequela is anything that happens after the fact. So these are different ways that you could have multiple codes, and you just need to read very carefully in your coding manual. Now, if it's a combination code, then the most important thing to remember is you can't use two codes if it's a combination code. So if it's asking for something that's the right and left, and you're trying to code it right and left instead of this one code that's for bilateral, you're going to be in error. You have to use the code that's the combination of the two. Sequela, this is the late effects that I was talking about earlier. If there is any type of residual effect, that has to be coded, and it depends upon what effect that is. Just remember, if you are trying to code the same diagnosis more than once, you can't do that. For each encounter, it can only be reported one time. And that really applies to any of the bilateral conditions. So you just need to make sure only one time. Now when you're looking at that bilateral, here's exactly what you need to know. So some of the codes indicate laterality. So some of the codes may say left or right or bilateral. But if no bilateral code is provided and the condition that happened is bilateral, then you can assign separate codes for each side. But if it's not, if there's no bilateral code, you can do that. But if there is a bilateral code, you can't. You have to use that bilateral code. Now, we already talked about using sign or symptoms, and then we also have what's called unspecified codes. Now, if you have all the information and you can get a specific diagnosis, that's the code that you should be using at that time. So you try to use that specific code, but if it does not give you enough information to have a complete diagnosis, then you're going to have to use the signs or symptoms or an unspecified. Unfortunately, that will affect the provider's money, but sometimes you don't have a choice, that there's just not enough information available to get that specificity. Now, if at the time of discharge, the diagnosis is suspected or possible or to be ruled out, those type of things, you can actually use that as an established diagnosis, as if the condition did exist. But you can only do so if it's on an inpatient admission. Any other type of admission, such as outpatient, you cannot do that. This was just a real quick overview of the highlights of this chapter. There is a lot more information in it, in different types of patient settings as to how you're going to code that. But read this chapter very carefully, because from here on out you're going to have to use these guidelines for your coding. If you have any questions, let me know.